investigators, including historians of linguistics, sometimes observe that there is little reference to evolution of language in the early literature of generative grammar. That's quite correct, but the reasons are apparently not understood. The topic was much discussed from the early 1950s, later by Lenneberg and in scientific conferences, but for the reasons mentioned, there could be few substantive conclusions, hence few references. By the early 1990s, there was, contrary to the standard story, little, quoting again, little respectable new scientific information relevant to the evolution of language to be synthesized, nor were there intellectual roadblocks to be demolished. But several changes did take place. One change is what I mentioned. Progress in the study of UG raised the possibility that something like SMT might be correct. That suggested that a major barrier to the study of evolution of language might be overcome. A second development was the appearance of a very important paper by evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin, who explained in some detail why it would be next to impossible to study the evolution of cognition, language in particular, by any approach currently understood. And the third change was the beginning of a vast outpouring of papers and books on evolution of language, all ignoring Lewontin's careful and I think persuasive arguments, much to their detriment in my opinion, and almost always avoiding the advances in understanding of UG that open the way to at least some investigation of the topic. In fact, a common conclusion is that UG does not exist. UG is dead, as Michael Tomasello puts it. If that's the case, then there is no topic of evolution of UG, of course. That is, no topic of evolution of language in the only coherent sense. Rather, emergence of language reduces to evolution of cognitive processes that cannot be seriously investigated for the reasons that Lewontin discussed. So, end of discussion. It's also necessary to ignore the substantial evidence on dissociation of language capacity from other cognitive processes, as in fact is commonly done. It's also necessary to ignore the uniqueness of UG to humans, a fact which is evident from the first moment of birth. So a newborn human infant instantly selects from the environment language-related data, which is no trivial feat. An ape with approximately the same auditory system hears only noise. The human infant then proceeds on a systematic course of acquisition that is unique to humans and that demonstrably goes beyond, far beyond, what any general learning mechanism can provide. That's true from word learning to syntactic structure and semantic interpretation. The huge growth of a field that barely exists raises some interesting questions about sociology of science. I'll put them aside here and turn to what seems to me to be a productive approach to the questions that arise, emphasizing that this is very far from a consensus view, and that, of course, it is speculative for Lewontin's reasons. So let's proceed, nevertheless. To the extent that SMT holds, we can at least formulate the problem of evolution of the capacity of language in a coherent way. If it does not, we cannot formulate the problem. Let's then ask what conclusions about language and its evolution would arise insofar as something like SMT holds. Well, every computational system has embedded within it somewhere an operation that applies to two objects, call them X and Y, which have already been constructed, and constructs from them a new object, call it Z. That's the essence of computation. Call this operation merge. SMT dictates that merge will be as simple as possible. That means it will not modify X and Y while constructing Z, nor will it impose any arrangement on them. In particular, it will leave them unordered. It's an important fact to which I'll return. It follows from that that merge is simply set formation. The merge of X and Y yields the set containing X and Y. Well, we can think of the computational process as operating like this. There's a workspace which has access to the lexicon of atomic elements and which contains any new object that's constructed. To carry a computation forward, an element X is selected from the workspace, then a second element Y is selected. X and Y can be two distinct elements selected from the workspace, as for example when read and books are merged to form the syntactic object underlying the phrase read books. That's called external merge. The other possible alternative, the only possible alternative, is that one of X and Y is part of the other. It's called internal merge. An example would be when the phrase, he will read which books, is merged with the phrase, which books, within it, to yield which books he will read which books, which underlies the sentence, which books will he read, by other rules. That's an example of the ubiquitous property of displacement found everywhere in all languages, phrases being pronounced in one place and interpreted both there and in another place. It had long been supposed, by me in particular, that displacement is a very strange imperfection of language. On the contrary, it turns out that it's an automatic property of a very elementary computational process, the most elementary one that can be conceived. So to repeat, merge of he will read which books and which books yields which books he will read which books. That has two occurrences of which books. The reason is that merge doesn't change the merged elements. It's optimal. Now that turns out to be a very important fact. This copy property of internal merge accounts for the interpretation of sentences with displacement. So we understand the sentence, which book will he read, to mean something like, for which books X, he will read the books X, with the phrase, which books, assign semantic roles in two distinct positions. And in fact, quite complex properties of sentence interpretation fall out at once from these optimal assumptions about computation. So let me illustrate with a very simple example. Consider the sentence, the boys expect to meet each other. It means each of the boys expects to meet the other boys. Suppose we embed this sentence in the context, I wonder who. That yields, I wonder who the boys expect to meet each other. The former interpretation disappears. Here the phrase each other refers back to the remote element who, not the proximal element the boys in I wonder who the boys expect to meet each other. The reason is that for the mind, though not the ear, the proximal element really is who. In the mental expression, I wonder who the boys expect who to meet each other, thanks to the copy property of internal merge. To take a more complex example, consider the sentence, which one of the paintings did the gallery expect that every artist likes best? The answer can be his first one, different for every artist. The quantified phrase, every artist, binds the pronoun his in the phrase, which one of his paintings, though an interpretation like that is not possible in the structurally very similar sentence, one of his paintings persuaded the gallery that every artist likes flowers. The reason is, again, the copy property of internal merge, of displacement. What the mind receives is, which one of his paintings did the gallery expect that every artist likes which one of his paintings best? That's a normal configuration for binding by a quantifier, as in, every artist likes his first painting best. And as sentence complexity increases, there are many intricate consequences. Clearly, none of this can be possibly learned by induction, statistical analysis of big data, other general mechanisms that are fashionable today, but the results do follow in a rich variety of cases from the fundamental architecture of language, assuming SMT. Well, if both of the copies were pronounced in examples such as these, perception would be much easier. In fact, one of the main problems faced in theories of perception or programs of machine parsing and interpretation, one of the main problems is to find the unpronounced gaps, what are called filler gap problems. And there's a good computational reason why only one of the copies is pronounced. To pronounce more of them, and there could be several, would yield enormous computational complexity in all but the very simplest cases. So we therefore have a conflict between computational efficiency and efficiency of use. And computational efficiency wins hands down, universally in all languages. As far as is known, this is true of all constructions in all languages. There's no time to go into it here, but there are many other cases of conflict between computational efficiency and efficiency of use, parsability, communication, and so on. In all known cases, efficiency of use is sacrificed. Language design keeps to computational efficiency. And these examples are by no means marginal. The case just discussed, for example, is the core problem of parsability and perception. Well, these results suggest strongly that language evolved for thought and interpretation, that it's fundamentally a system of meaning. That would mean that Aristotle's classic dictum that languages sound with meaning should actually be reversed. The language's meaning with sound or some other externalization or none at all, and the concept with is richly significant. Externalization at the sensory motor level then appears to be an ancillary process, reflecting properties of the sensory modality that's used. In fact, there are different arrangements for sign and speech. It would also follow that the modern doctrine, and it is modern, that communication is somehow the function of language is mistaken, and that a traditional conception of language as an instrument of thought is more nearly correct. In a fundamental way, the language apparently really is a system of audible signs for thought. In Whitney's words, he's expressing a traditional view. The modern conception that communication is the function of language, whatever that is supposed to mean, which is not very clear, that probably derives from the mistaken belief that somehow language must have evolved from animal communication, though evolutionary biology supports no such conclusion, as Lenneberg already showed half a century ago. And the available evidence is strongly against it in virtually every important respect, from word meaning to the basic property. In acquisition and use, language, apparently human language, appears to be radically different from systems of animal communication, lending support to Lenneberg's dissociationist thesis. One might suspect that the modern conception also derives from lingering behaviorist tendencies, which have little merit, in my opinion. Whatever the reasons, the evidence available seems to me strongly to favor the traditional view that language is fundamentally a system of thought. And there is substantial further evidence for this conclusion. Notice again that the optimal computational operation, merge, imposes no order on the merged elements. So it follows then that the mental operations involving language should be independent of order, which is, order should be simply a reflex of the sensory motor system. We have to impose linear order on words when we speak. The sensory motor system apparently was substantially in place long before language emerged, and it appears to have little to do with language. It does not permit production in parallel or production of structures, but that limitation seems to have nothing to do with language, only with the sensory motor, this particular sensory motor modality. Actually, it is different if the modality is sign. And as I mentioned earlier, apes that have approximately the same auditory system as humans hear only noise when language is produced, though a newborn infant instantly extracts language-relevant data from the noisy environment using the unique human language faculty, which is much more deeply embedded in the brain. Some illustrations of these conclusions are quite familiar. So, for example, languages differ in whether they have verb-object or object-verb constructions, but the languages assign the identical semantic roles independently of the order. And the conclusions appear to generalize far beyond. These observations have some quite interesting empirical consequences, bearing on puzzles that arose 60 years ago. So consider the sentence, birds that fly instinctively swim, or the sentence, the desire to fly instinctively appeals to children. Now, these sentences are ambiguous. The adverb instinctively can be associated with the previous verb, fly instinctively, or the following one, instinctively swim, or instinctively appeals. Suppose now that we extract the adverb from the sentences, forming instinctively birds that fly swim, instinctively the desire to fly appeals to children. And now the ambiguity is eliminated. The adverb is construed only with the remote verb, swim or appeals, not with the proximal verb, fly. These facts are one illustration of a universal property of language, the property of structure dependence of rules. The computational rules of language ignore the very simple property of linear distance and keep to the much more complex property of structural distance. That's a puzzle. It's a strange puzzle. It was noticed long ago when the earliest efforts were made to construct precise grammars. There have been many attempts to show that the consequences can be derived from data and experience. In fact, this is the major case by far within computational cognitive science of an effort to deal with some non-trivial property of language. all efforts fail totally, and it's obvious why. In cases like the one I mentioned, there simply is no data. The child has no evidence at all to show that the simple property of linear distance must be ignored in favor of the complex property of structural distance. Nevertheless, experiment by Steve Crane shows that children understand that rules are structure dependent as early as they can be tested, by about age 3, and do not make errors, and of course are not instructed. All of this follows at once if we assume that SMT holds, that the computations of language are as simple as possible, and there is no other explanation offered. The failed efforts, there are many, have kept to auxiliary inversion and to relative clauses, which were indeed the earliest cases discussed. This artificial limitation misled researchers into believing that the phenomenon might have something to do with raising rules, or that there might be data available to the child, or that the phenomenon might have something to do with presupposed information in relative clauses among the many proposals made. Even in these terms, the efforts are a complete failure, but when we move beyond the earliest illustrations to rules of construal, such as those I mentioned, which behave in exactly the same way, it becomes entirely clear that all of the efforts in the literature totally decide the point. So again, there is a very simple explanation for the puzzling phenomena, furthermore the only explanation that survives inspection. The results follow from the optimal assumption about the nature of UG, the strong minimalist thesis SMT. While some researchers have at least tried to account for the phenomena, others fail to understand that it's a puzzle at all. One example is F.J. Neumeier, historian of linguistics. He proposes, quoting him, that structure dependence of rules follows from design pressures to make all information-bearing complex systems structured hierarchies. There are, in fact, far simpler and more persuasive reasons why a computational procedure yields structured hierarchies, but that fact leaves the puzzle unchanged. Both structured hierarchy and linear order clearly exist. The puzzle is why the simple computational operation of shortest linear distance is universally ignored in favor of the more complex operation of shortest structural distance. Doesn't help to say that structured hierarchy is available. So is linear order available, plainly. Incidentally, this is a rather common error, right to technical articles appearing in the current literature. And incidentally, on the side, it's only one of a series of errors that render this particular article irrelevant to its goal of refuting earlier versions of arguments related to those I'm reviewing here, errors that also undermine conclusions drawn by other authors in the curious volume on evolution of language in which it appears, the one I cited earlier. And the word curious is indeed appropriate. The misinterpretations that appear there and elsewhere are sometimes curious indeed. One is the confusion between evolution and natural selection, which are of course distinct. Natural selection is a factor in evolution, as Darwin stressed, not the factor. Other errors are stranger still. So Jean Aitchison, in the same volume, discusses what she calls the pop hypothesis, that language might have popped into existence relatively fast. And to illustrate the absurdity of this hypothesis, she cites my reference to the idea that half a wing is not useful for flying, failing to mention, however, that I brought this up as a fallacy and went on in the following sentences to cite a recent technical publication proposing that insect wings evolved initially as thermoregulators and were then accepted for flying. Regrettably, these are not exceptions in the literature on evolution of language, but I won't tarry on that matter here. Well, returning to the main topic, it's also of some significance, I think, that the apparent variety and complexity of language and its susceptibility to change lie mostly, and perhaps even entirely, in the process of externalization, not in the systems that generate the underlying expressions and provide them to the conceptual interface for other mental operations. These appear to be virtually uniform among languages, and if that turns out to be true, which increasingly seems to be the case, it would not at all be surprising, because the child receives virtually no evidence about them, as in the simple cases I mentioned, no evidence at all in cases like these, and the facts become much more dramatic as we turn to examples of normal complexity. There's also both neurological evidence and some evolutionary evidence to support the conclusion about the ancillary character of externalization in one or another modality, and hence about the ancillary character of use of language for communication and other forms of interchange. Research conducted in Milan a decade ago, initiated by Andrea Moro, showed that nonsense systems keeping to UG principles elicit normal activation in the language areas of the brain, but much simpler nonsense systems using linear order in violation of UG yield diffuse activation, implying that subjects are treating them as a puzzle and not as a nonsense language. There's confirming evidence by Neil Smith and Yanthi Simpli in their investigation of a cognitively deficient but linguistically gifted subject. And Smith and Simpli also made the interesting observation that normals can solve the problem if it's presented to them as a puzzle, but not if it's presented to them as a language, presumably activating the language faculty. Now, these studies suggest some very intriguing paths that can be pursued in neuroscience and experimental psycholinguistics. Well, to summarize briefly, the optimal conclusions about the nature of language would be that its basic principles are extremely simple, perhaps even optimal for computational systems. Now, that was, in fact, the goal that has been sought since the earliest study of generative grammar in the mid-20th century. It seemed completely unattainable in earlier years, but much less out of reach today. And from that optimal assumption, some quite interesting empirical conclusions follow. For one, we see that displacement, far from being a puzzling anomaly, in fact is an expected property of a perfectly designed language. It would be more complex if it didn't exist. Furthermore, optimal design yields the copy property of displacement with quite rich and complex consequences for semantic interpretation. We also have an immediate explanation for the very puzzling fact that language ignores simple properties of linear order and uniformly relies on the more complex property of structural distance in all languages, in all constructions. Again, of course, without data for the child. We also have an explanation for the apparent fact that the diversity, complexity, and malleability of language, subject to change, is mostly, maybe entirely, localized in an external system that is ancillary to the core internal properties of language structure and semantic interpretation. If all of this is correct, we see that language is well designed for computational efficiency and expression of thought, but poses serious problems for use, in particular for communication. Language is, in essence, an instrument of thought, as traditionally assumed. Now, of course, the term designed is a metaphor. What it means is that the simplest evolutionary process consistent with the basic property of human language yields a system of thought and understanding, computationally efficient, since there were no external pressures preventing this optimal outcome. Well, returning to the two facts of evolutionary history, one firm, the other reasonable, a plausible speculation is that some small rewiring of the brain within that narrow evolutionary window provided the core element of the basic property, namely an optimal computational procedure which yields an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions, each interpreted systematically at the conceptual interface with other cognitive systems. That's different from the way I formulated the basic property before, keeping to the conceptual interface. In fact, it's not easy to conceive of a different possibility, different coherent possibility, since there can't be a series of small steps that leads to infinite yield. That's a logical impossibility. A mutation, of course, takes place in an individual, not in a group. An individual endowed with this small rewiring, it would have advantages, capacity to think and plan and so on, and the capacity might proliferate through a small breeding group over generations. At some point, externalization would be useful, but it poses hard cognitive problems. A system designed for computational efficiency must be mapped to a sensory motor system that's quite independent of it. That problem can be solved in many ways, of course with constraints, yielding superficial variety and complexity, and perhaps involving no evolution at all. Could be just a cognitive problem. Now that fits pretty well with what we observe, and it seems to me the most parsimonious explanation, a speculation, though of course it is a speculation for Dick Lewontin's reasons. Well, needless to say, these remarks only scratch the surface. There is recent work exploring the SMT in new and I think promising directions, and quite naturally a vast array of phenomena that have been unearthed about language remain barely examined, unexplained. But the picture that I sketched here seems to me the most plausible one that we have, and one that offers many opportunities for fruitful research and inquiry. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Noam. And actually, many of the people that you mentioned, like Stephen Crane and Neil Smith and Andrea Moro, are all here today. So the talk is open for questions. Who can I give the microphone? Don't be shy. Here's the microphone. So Tecumseh Fitch would like to ask a question. This one.
Okay. Hi, Noam. I don't know if you can see on here, but we can see you.
Yeah.
So I just had
I can see, but I can't hear very well.
You cannot hear? Can you?
I can hear, but my hearing is not great, but I'll try.
Okay, I'll try and speak very clearly. I had two clarification questions about the copy principle of internal merge. These are just the naive biologist not understanding. So in your example where we have which books will he will read which books, and you merge that with which books. The copy principle that you told us about explains why we don't hear which books chased. So when we output, we only hear that the first time. So that gives us which books he will read, but we still have this inversion in English, which books will he read? That's what we actually say in English. So there's something else that happens there. And what's the explanation for that?
Well, the optimal computation tells us two things. First, it tells us that the copy theory, the copy property holds. That is, what reaches the mind is which books he hears which books, because merge, being optimal, doesn't delete either of them. It also tells us why what reaches the ear drops one of the two, namely that to keep both would yield computational complexity. Now, you're pointing out that there are other rules involved, like the rule of inversion. So why do we say will he instead of he will? Actually, we can make up examples in which there's no inversion, just to make it look simpler. So if we said, I wonder which books he will read, which books, that's what would reach the mind. What would reach the ear would be, I wonder which books he will read, and there's no inversion. Okay, the inversion holds only in what's called a matrix sentence, the top sentence, not in embedded sentences. And the reason for that is a phenomenon that appears in many languages of raising of the verbal element to a second position in the matrix sentence, in the external part of the total sentence. It's another rule. And we have to abstract away from that to see the way the copy property is working. If we take embedded cases, like guess which book he reads, or I wonder which book he reads, we don't have that extra complication. Does that respond to the query?
It does, but it still begs the question that I really want to know, which is that extra inversion that you're talking about, is that done as part of externalization, or is there is it a different version of internal merge, or who does the work?
Well, actually, that's an important question, and not a trivial one, and much contested. The usual way of looking at this is that the inflectional element to which a verb is attached, is adjoined, raises to the second position. I think that's a mistake. I think actually this has to do with the nature of what's called head movement. In my own view, it's discussed in a recent paper, which still isn't out, but it's where a lot of you have seen, is that head movement has been misinterpreted. Head movement has always been interpreted as if the raised element adjoins to the element to which it attaches. But I think it's pretty clearly the other way around. The element to which it attaches is adjoined to the raised element. So when you raise verb to inflection, the result is not an inflection with a verb adjoined to it. It's a verb with an inflection adjoined to it. And that means that the raising from T, what's usually called T, the inflectional element, to C, the second position, complementizer position, is actually verb raising. It's not inflection raising. The verb raising is something that happens in all kinds of languages, German, Dutch, others, and it's probably the same thing in English. Not inflection to complementizer, but just normal verb raising. That's not the usual view, incidentally. It isn't even in the literature up until an unpublished paper of mine that's coming out.
Okay, thanks. And my second question about the copy principle is, why would it be so computationally inefficient or so computationally expensive to simply pronounce the whole thing? It just doesn't seem like it would be computationally expensive. It would make long sentences. They'd be kind of add words, but that seems like would be a small price to pay. So why? What's the computational expense?
Yeah. Well, you have to think about the externalization process, which includes morphology, phonology, and phonetics, right? If you have a phrase like, say, which picture of the artist, and you have to articulate it. You have to go through all the computations of morphology and phonology all inside the mind, and ultimately the articulatory motions. And that's a huge computational problem, especially because it can appear over and over. And these phrases, remember, can be of arbitrary complexity. So it could be which picture of the artist that he painted last year while he was in England. To run through just the phonological and morphological operations that yield the narrow phonetics is a huge amount of computation. And that can remember of course, that this is also successive cyclic movement. So these things appear at many points in the utterance. That's an enormous computational burden. And in addition, it's an enormous articulatory burden, in addition to the internal computation. So I think there's a very strong computational reason why only one is pronounced. The question then arises, which one? Well, there are three possibilities. It could be, the top one, could be the bottom one, or it could be one of the medial ones. In reality, what we hear is either the lowest one, which is called an in situ language, or the highest one, which is like English, although English also has in situ constructions. But those are the two things that appear as possibilities. What is not a possibility is leaving the WH phrase in the middle. Now, it can appear in the middle, like after a word like wonder, but it can't appear in the middle in a declarative embedded sentence, although there's very strong reason to believe that it appears there. And then comes the question, well, why can't it appear in the middle? Actually, I think I've suggested what seems to me an interesting answer to that. I don't have time to talk about it here, some of you know about it, in terms of what's called labeling theory, the theory of how phrases get identified for semantic and phonological interpretation. That appears discussed in a paper that appeared in Journal Lingua about a year ago called Problems of Projection. And there's a lot of further work on this topic by René Hooybroek, Susser, other people. But that's basically the story.
Great. Thanks.
At least.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Willem Zuidema.
So thank you very much, Willem Zuidema from Amsterdam. So as one of James Herford's former students, I was hoping I could ask you a question about that scenario you presented towards the end. And I think that sounds plausible, as you were saying. But you would need at some point, so if I understood it right, you're saying like merge appears in an individual, manages to spread in the population, and then the solution of how the interface constraints are solved basically that can work out in all kinds of different ways. I hope I understood that right. But that process of sort of working out all of those that interface business, is that happening in just the head of one single individual, or is that a process that unfolds over several generations where something that Jim Herford and I would call cultural evolution might play some role? Or I don't see why that wouldn't be a helpful addition to the scenario.
Well, I'm uncomfortable about the phrase cultural evolution because I think I prefer, at least personally, to take the term evolution much more seriously and restrict it to biological objects. There definitely is cultural change, okay, but I think it's confusing to describe it as evolution. It has no similarity to biological evolution. But that's a terminological point. I think the question you bring up raises very serious issues. First of all, notice that there are two questions about connection to interfaces. One question is, let's say merge evolves an individual. Okay, that individual can then construct an arbitrary number of hierarchically structured expressions. But to be at all useful to the individual, it has to link to the conceptual interface. Okay, how does that happen? Well, that's total mystery. That goes back to the mystery that I mentioned at the beginning about the total mystery of how the atomic elements of the computation emerged. The simplest words of human language, river, tree, person, you name it, all have the property, do not have the referentialist property. They do not link to extramental entities, contrary to animal communication, where that linkage seems to be universal. This, as I mentioned, goes back to the pre-Socratics, who raised questions like this about river. Aristotle discussed the question of, used the example of house. The early modern philosophers, 17th, 18th century, Locke, Hume, and others, that were concerned with many examples, including a crucial one, person, and so on. And most of this has been forgotten, but it's very important. And it relates to the first part of the linkage to the conceptual interface. Somehow, and we don't know how, these atomic elements emerged in human evolutionary history. They have to be used by the computational process, and that means that the result, that the expression that is created by the process must have an interpretation at the thought interface. Well, going back to your question, that has to happen in an individual, the first individual for whom the system was at all useful. Actually, it's perfectly conceivable that endless numbers of times in the prehistory of humans, merge appeared, but was never linked to anything. So it simply would have died out because it would have had no use. Just kind of like an accidental development that disappears. That's quite possible. And maybe it even, though I don't know of any evidence for it, exists in some other organisms, but is not linked to anything, so therefore it just dies out. The linkage to the sensory motor interface, I think, is quite different. The speculation that I'm proposing is that merge linked to the conceptual interface using the atoms, which are a mystery, appeared in a single individual. That's almost a logical necessity. So I think we can safely assume that. Possibly it could have proliferated since it's genetic property, it could have proliferated to future generations, some of them. At some point, remember we're talking about small breeding groups, a number of people in that breeding group would have had the internal capacity. And at that point it becomes useful to interact with it. But how do you do it? You have to solve the problem of how to map this internal system, which may satisfy SMT, to a sensory motor system, which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years and has nothing to do with it. That mapping is complex. And in fact, what we discover is, I think, that overwhelmingly, and maybe completely, the complexity, variety, malleability of language lies in that part of the system, in the morphology, phonology, phonetics. That's what you learn when you learn a second language. When you learn a second language, you don't learn structure dependence. You don't learn the copy property. Nobody's ever learned that. In fact, nobody even noticed it until recently. What you learn is the phonetics, the phonology, the irregular verbs, some facts about word order, things like that, which are all, I think, part of the externalization. So how would that develop? Well, through interaction among people. The nature of the culture would have an effect. There could be cultural processes that lead it to develop one way or another. As I said, I would prefer not to call them evolution, but that's terminological. That's the speculation that I'm proposing. Does that respond to the question?
Okay, thanks very much. The next question is from Bart de Boer.
Yes. So it's in a sense a follow-up to what Jelle just asked, but it has to do with the timing of the biological evolution. And I find your argument that if language evolved late, the cognitive changes must have been simple, very persuasive. But then we do find evidence of a fair amount of adaptation in the externalization system as well. So for instance, our sensitivity, our infants' sensitivity to language that you mentioned must have evolved as well. So
I'm sorry, what is it must evolve?
The sensitivity for speech, for instance, that infants
the capacity for speech.
Yeah, and the capacity to learn it. So my worry is, aren't you shifting the whole problem by saying, well, because we've had there's been very little time for language to evolve, but then all of this complexity, all these biological adaptations to externalization must now have evolved in the last, say, 75,000 years as well. Well,
I'm not convinced that they've evolved at all. They developed, but it doesn't follow that they evolved. Let's use the term evolution in its literal sense. Genomic change, basically. It's not clear that that's involved in the, say, ability to pronounce. Or let's take the ability to use signs, which is pretty much common to humans and apes. And as we know, sign works dramatically like spoken language. To find it, and children acquire sign language at the same rate, at the same stages, and so on as spoken languages. You know, babbling, interchange of pronouns, first and second pronoun, and roughly 15 months of age, the structures, and so on. Looks like the same process. And it's using a modality which may have very early evolutionary origins. It's pretty much common to us in apes. As far as the articulatory mechanisms are concerned, there has been speculation about, lowering the larynx and so on and so forth, but I think it's pretty weak. I don't think it gives strong evidence that any of this co-evolved with language. It probably is just there because that's the way for whatever reason it developed, and then it's taken over, it's appropriated for externalization when that process, when the mapping from the internal mental system to the sensory motor system is undertaken, and in many different ways. There are constraints, of course, but we find a fair variety of phonetic outputs in languages across the world, and sign is entirely different. In fact, as we know, it can even be, the modality that's used can even be touch, the Helen Keller type case. So it's pretty likely that any sensory modality is available. For humans, we can't use smell because it's just too primitive. Maybe dogs could use smell. But we humans can use sound, sight, and touch at least, and none of which, at least sign and touch, certainly didn't co-evolve with language.
Okay, thanks very much. The next question is from Ian Tattersall.
Oh, hello. Yes, I'm Ian Tattersall. I'm a paleontologist. And first of all, I'd like to say I really liked a lot what you said about the evolutionary process, and particularly about the dangers of conflating evolution and natural selection. And I think there is a pretty simple solution to this matter that we've just been discussing. The anatomical species Homo sapiens came into existence about 200,000 years ago. But the real inflection in the complexity of behavior as we see it in the archaeological record occurred just in that time scale that you were talking about, 100,000, 75,000 years ago, by which time everything must have been in place. The obvious point at which both the computational ability was achieved presumably was that enormous developmental event when Homo sapiens as a anatomically recognizable and highly derived species came into existence around 200,000 years ago. And it was this new capacity simply lay fallow for 100,000 years until it was recruited by some behavioral means, possibly the adoption of language. And at that point, of course, the peripheral structures that allow the externalization of speech, the sensory motor structures would already have been in place, as they would have been since the birth of the species itself. So I don't think we have a problem in matching the two things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. Actually, just side comment. The reason why I'm suggesting that, the reason why we were agreeing on what the probable range is, because I'm quoting you, you know. Okay, so so that accounts for the agreement. There is a possibility different. As far as I can see, there are two possibilities we can imagine. I would describe it a little bit differently than you did. One is the one I mentioned, that say, 75,000 years ago, something like that, a mutation caused a rewiring of the brain in an individual, yielding kind of a language of thought. And at some point in the following years, the problem of externalization was faced. That's one possibility. Another possibility is what you suggested, if I understand it correctly, that 200,000 years ago, this mutation and rewiring took place along with the linkage to the conceptual structure, so that the individual involved and any future generations had a system of thought, but that it wasn't until 75,000 years ago that they began to externalize it. Okay, that's another, that it lay fallow, as you like. That's possible. All of this is pure speculation. So, but as far as I can see, those are the only two. A third possibility is that somewhere in the middle, maybe 120,000 years ago, this event took place after the species was established. This event took place in the brain. I think there is some evidence for brain expansion around 100,000 years or so. So maybe something took place then and then lay fallow until it began to be externalized. The question really is this creative leap that you discuss in your articles and recent book, say around 75,000 years, is that connected to the externalization of the system, or is it connected to the origin of the system? And I don't see any way to settle that.
Oh, I think that's a very excellent question, and one that we're not really in a position to settle. The thing that strikes me, though, is that Homo sapiens is incredibly derived. We have a lot of knowledge of the primitive body form of the genus Homo, and I think the Neanderthals are a pretty good exemplar of this. And Homo sapiens is the antithesis of that very robust, that very broad, broad pelvised, conical thorax kind of anatomy. There was a major developmental reorganization at the origin of Homo sapiens, and it seems to me to make sense to link a lot of these changes we're talking about to that one event at which Homo sapiens came into existence, which would have been, we think, around 200,000 years ago.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, but it also makes sense to suppose that the changes in the archaeological record that